Apologies for starting late. We will go over, if that's okay with the audience, about 7 minutes to take your questions. So I'm Mike Pregent of the Hudson Institute. Thank you all for coming. I'd ask everybody to turn your cell phones off, just because I just had to turn mine off. And we have a pretty timely panel today, especially with what happened in the last 24 hours. So hopefully it'll be lively, it'll be engaging. And I'd like to introduce the panelists. To my immediate right is Dr. Nahro Zagros, the Vice President of Soran University in Iraq. They're based out of Erbil province. It's good to have you here. And then Senior Fellow from Hudson, Hillel Fradkin, is the Director for the Center of Islam, Democracy, and the Future of the Muslim World here at Hudson. And it's great to have you on as well.
Thanks.
Jennifer from the Institute for the Study of War. She was a panelist here about 2 weeks ago, and we're glad to have her back. And of course, it's good to have you here. I want to have a diverse perspective here on what's happening in Syria, Iraq, vis-a-vis adversaries and allies. And we have Dr. Ammar Kahf, co-founder and executive director of the Omran Center for Strategic Studies. So I'm going to let our senior fellow, Hillel, he's going to set the scene. It'll take about 4 minutes to talk about what's going on now, and then I'll take it from there. We'll start with you.
Okay, thanks very much, Mike. I also want to thank Mike more generally for the continuity of this kind of event, because this is a very dynamic region, was one way to put it, and it's really very helpful to have this, not one-off events is unfortunately so often the case in Washington, where an issue is raised and then forgotten. And I'm glad that you're going to continue to do this. What I want to say is as follows. A quite simple point, but one that it needs to be made, I think, as regards to the United States. And what I have to say is largely, most immediately be about Syria, but we'll get back to Iraq, I think, in the course of the discussion. It's this. The United States is now a party to the Syrian civil war. That is a clear party to the Syrian civil war. Clear, at least in terms of the objective reality. Not so clear in terms of what we say about it. This is not entirely surprising, because we got to this point in a very unexpected, unintended, and indirect way. If you go back to 2011, President Obama was clear that he wanted us not to get into the Syrian civil war, insisted on it even over the advice of several senior security people at the time. And that's where we would be, but for something called the Islamic State. And we have come to be a party in the Syrian civil war because of the Islamic State. Now, we were also a party to the Iraqi civil war for the same result. And there's a way in which we should talk about ourselves as a party to the present Iraqi situation. But the reason I stress the Syrian case is this. In Syria, unlike in Iraq, at least at the present time, and even in the past, we are in control of or protectors of a very large part of Syrian territory, a very large part, and including some very valuable territory from the perspective of Syria. And that makes us a party to the war. Now, because of the way in which we started, it was never, the Obama administration never said that that was what we were about and not where we would wind up, but that's where we wound up. In a way, the present administration continues along in the same vein. Our officials continue to tirelessly say that we are simply in Syria to fight the Islamic State, which implies that once that fight is over, we will leave. But even they probably are getting a little tired of saying these things, because they're not really credible in two ways. One is we now may have other objectives in Syria. People have suggested what those might be. One is, now that we have a serious position in Syria, that we can be a serious player in the negotiations, if they should occur, for the resolution of the civil war, which we were not in the previous administration. Senator Kerry spent an enormous amount of time on it, but all to little effect, partially because we had no leverage in the situation. The other objective, also mentioned, would be to push back, as we put it, Iran and its malevolent designs in Syria, Iraq, and in general in the Middle East. Both of those are possible objectives, given the position we now occupy. The question for the United States at this point, and this is why I wanted to stress from the outset that we are now a party to the war, are those or any other things going to become our objectives? And if so, how do we really mean to proceed? There's another reason why we haven't kind of faced this or stated it as clearly, it seems to me, because once you state it, then you more or less also have to answer the question what you're going to do with the other parties to the civil war, namely Syria, Iran, Russia, and now Turkey. Now, and we've already seen what that could possibly mean in the case of Syria, Iran, and Russia, because their forces have tried to attack territory controlled by us and defended by us. We defended ourselves twice now, I think, or maybe 3 times, in the southeast, and then in the east, and near Deir ez-Zor. We're capable of doing that, but we also, then the question is what follows from that. The most immediate, there's this other issue now that has come into play, and I expect we will talk a bit about this, because we now have another adversary in Syria, known as Turkey, which is also known as an ally. And it's becoming, most recently, President Erdogan has said that having taken control of a Kurdish area known as Afrin, he means to move east to areas that are controlled by us. And if we don't yield to him, he has said he would fire on American troops if we didn't. Hell of an ally. But it is something we have to deal with. And I think in general, and this is where I'll end, the immediate crisis in Syria vis-a-vis us and the Turks, I think needs to lead and will lead to a much larger discussion about where our alliance, if it still exists with the Turks, goes in the future. And that's a subject I'd like to return back to, because there's already a discussion about this in town, and I think we should pursue it. But definitely.
So the panel's titled "The U.S. in a Post-ISIS Iraq and Syria: Realigning Allies and Constraining Adversaries, and What Happens When an Ally Becomes an Adversary or Acts Adversarial in the Case of Turkey." So I want to now pass it to Jennifer. Right. There seems to be a common theme that, you thank the Kurds in Iraq and Syria for helping us take back territory from ISIS, and then you abandon the Kurds in Iraq and Syria after you declared victory against ISIS, only to have that territory be lost again to something else. But Jennifer, can you tell us what's been going on in the last 2 weeks, especially in the last 72 hours?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me back here. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think we're in the post-ISIS phase of the Syrian civil war, but we're also in the post-ISIS phase of the security situation in Iraq. What the United States is confronting with respect to Turkey, but a number of other actors, to include the Syrian regime, the Iranians, the Russians, is that the unity that the United States was able to generate in the counter-ISIS fight has completely broken down regarding any question, security or political, regarding what should come next and what should replace ISIS. The biggest immediate challenge the United States faces is, of course, Turkey's war against America's local partner, the Syrian Kurdish YPG, which the Turks view, in my view, correctly, as linked to the PKK insurgency inside of Turkey. The Turks have already attacked and defeated a YPG force in northwestern Syria, and the Turkish President Erdogan has threatened to conduct follow-on operations across northern Syria and into Iraq in order to pursue a larger military defeat of the YPG. The United States has been attempting to de-escalate the situation with the Turks engaging in a number of technical discussions and other meetings in the hope of halting the Turkish operation at Afrin. What looks likely to occur is actually one or more follow-on Turkish operations, possibly in the area of Sinjar in northwestern Iraq, which is situated near the Syrian-Iraqi border, which Erdogan has already declared. He has begun operations to clear PKK and YPG-affiliated forces from that area. Turkish forces haven't actually moved on that area, and what we've actually seen is a deployment of the Iraqi security forces to secure that terrain, possibly in an attempt to block any Turkish operation or to disincentivize the Turks from using military force. The U.S. commander of Central Command, General Joseph Votel, was in Baghdad meeting with Prime Minister Abadi over the weekend, and the U.S. may be brokering a deal with the Iraqi security forces in an effort to avoid further escalation. The problem remains, however, that Turkey is committed to further escalation against the YPG. So if we have blocked him in Sinjar, it doesn't necessarily make future escalation more likely. And what the U.S. is actually facing is a mutual escalation from the YPG, which has begun an insurgency campaign against Turkish armed forces in northwestern Syria, conducting already a number of IED attacks against Turkish forces, one of which actually occurred during a high-level battlefield circulation of Turkish officers in Afrin. So we're actually looking at future escalation that the U.S. may not be able to deter, given the number of different sites that actually Turkey has the opportunity to attack.
Well, what's interesting about that, it's once again, there's the repositioning of forces to take on something other than ISIS.
Okay.
Again, you have the Iraqi security forces moving to these areas, also with the Hashd al-Shabi, the IRGC-backed militias. And I wanted to ask a quick question for all the panelists, because there are some arguments. YPG connection to the PKK, what does it really mean? When I make the argument that Kitab Hezbollah or the Hashd al-Shabi or Asab al-Haq or these different groups are related to the IRGC, I can easily make the argument because IRGC lieutenants are in charge of them. There's funds going directly to them, they have weapons going directly to them, and they fall under an IRGC Quds Force command. But when I ask the same question about the YPG and the PKK, I don't get the funding, the training, the leadership. I get the political ideology links. But there was a recent transfer of PKK weapons to the YPG in Afrin. So I see those things, but are those alliances of necessity to defend against something, or is it the same argument I can make with the Hashd al-Shabi being directly linked to the IRGC Quds Force based on leaders, units, ideology, baya, if we want to use that term? So I'd like to ask all the panelists, because I know there's some differing agreements. And what you said about what Turkey is doing, and the reallocation of forces from the Iraqi security forces in Iraq, away from the ISIS fight, and then the SDF leaving Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor to go west of the Euphrates to help their brothers and sisters across the Euphrates. So in that, I know you want to say something about that, but I'd like to just, I don't want to have the argument of whether or not YPG and PK, but I do want you to talk about the similarities so we can break that down, because you have General Mattis, Secretary Tillerson, he's still there, saying that the YPG is an ally in Syria, yet can be an enemy across the border, and they're supposed to limit all their operations here. We understand why Turkey is concerned about them, and Secretary Tillerson went as far as saying, when you hit the YPG and others, try to be precise so you don't kill civilians. And that's just a really difficult message to translate on the ground when you're a U.S. advisor embedded with the SDF forces. So sorry to take so long, but did you want to make a comment, and then I'll throw it back to you, and then throw it back to you.
I think it's correct to say that YPG is linked to the PKK, but there was a time where we could separate the two, and we were going towards that direction. But I think the failure in understanding the reality there, the failure in understanding the complexity of the Kurdish situation in Syria, has led to the idea for the YPG to return to PKK. But at some point, when they were aligned with the U.S., when they were aligned, they were allies of the KRG in Iraqi Kurdistan, they were really shifting away from the leadership of Kandil Mountain or the PKK. But we lost that, so they had no hope but to go back to the PKK. But the problem is here, YPG is not attacking Turkey, so there is
Right.
never a big danger for Turkey to go into Syria to with the pretext that it's securing its border, because it wasn't a danger for the Turkish border. But what we see, the narrative we see in Turkish media and within the Turkish nationalist movement in Turkey is that it's not just about wiping out YPG or the terrorists or the PKK. It's it's much more wider than that. It's going all the way to Iraqi Kurdistan, all the way to the border, and killing the hope of any Kurdish or Kurdistan dream in the future. So it may started with the pretext that it's, Turkey is trying to protect its border from the terrorists, but now it's going beyond that. And yesterday we saw the Iraqi government stationing all this army in Sinjar because it was at a time where President Erdogan, at a meeting, the public meeting with his followers in Trabzon, in Turkey, he said the operation to attack YPG in Sinjar has started. And on Wednesday, PKK and the Iraqi government, or the YPG there, they said they evacuated, they left the city of Sinjar. So Iraq is saying there are no PKKs in Sinjar, no YPGs in Sinjar, and yet Turkey yesterday announced that they are going to attack Sinjar, and the Iraqi Ministry of Defense sent lots of armament and troops to be stationed in Sinjar. So there is some fear that Turkey might, come to Iraq, either from the north, from Soran region of Iraq, or from Syria. But also, we sometimes forget in this context that we have Turkish troops already stationed in northern Iraq. We have Turkish troops in Bashar, we have some places around Erbil, so there are Turkish troops. So I see that, this is the beginning of a much, much bigger problem. And the main thing that is going to escalate this war is because of lack of clear vision from the West, mainly from America. In this battle, I see, just returning to the title of the talk, I think in this battle, America is losing. America is losing the grip of the situation, and lack of clarity in the strategic point. It's pushing America's enemies more, achieving what they want to achieve. Iranians are achieving the objectives in Iraq, in Syria, the Turks as well, but I think America and American allies, Kurds and others, are losing in this battle.
And that's to Jennifer's point. Maybe General Votel is the one that's seen all of this happen, and to your point, went to Baghdad to get Baghdad to send regular army forces and not Hashd al-Shabi to Sinjar to be an actual hold force that the U.S. could partner with in order to assure Turkey they don't need to come in. But again, it's the holding the territory that keeps it from destabilizing with the right forces, and we just haven't seen it. This may be the first example of that, actually, where we actually have the right force going to hold territory to prevent escalation. And I want to ask both of you, do you think this is part of Erdogan's campaign, much like the Gulenist campaign, where he was able to roll up adversaries under the Gulen-sponsored coup, to be able to go after political adversaries, to jail journalists, to go after military commanders that had a pro-West position? And do you think he's doing that with his PKK campaign to go after Kurds of all stripes? But again, the Bashika and the Turkish presence in Erbil and Bashika, that's actually to train and enhance the capabilities of KDP Peshmerga in the fight of ISIS. But they may have shifted at this point. But I'll go to you to try to answer that long question, and then go back to you, and then throw it back to you as well.
Okay.
Well, I think it's definitely not in the best interest of any of the actors on the ground that an escalation of violence takes place. That would be the first point I need to settle on the floor. But going forward, I think from a Syrian perspective, inside Syria, that overlaps with the regional actors. Now we have 4 different armed boots on the ground armies, official armies and bases. Perhaps the only one not admitting and denying would be Iran denying its presence on the ground. And that's because it's been manipulating all the different actors to play to its own benefit by integrating itself within Sunni groups, within Shiite groups, within Christian groups on the ground, within the governance section. And so when, from the Turkish perspective, I'll go back to Turkey, they perceive the PYD as the same as PKK, and that many PKK leadership has gone into Syria and weapons are going back and forth through the borders. And so it wanted to push the line, push the envelope, so that it could present itself as a partner for future stability. I don't believe that Turkey has an interest to go at war against Kurds. Perhaps there are many mistakes on that side. At Omran Center, we did a lot of field studies on northeast Syria, but also in Afrin before the recent operation. And many of the local populations have been troubled by the interference of PYD as a political party and the YPG as an armed group within the local governance, within the local affairs of the of the population. Numerous human rights abuses have taken place, but nevertheless, people want to see something at the end. Many people don't support those who don't support the Turkish operation in Syria. Also don't support the PYD controlling their governance affairs. There is a security chaos going on, I believe, in northeast Syria today, very close to what took place in northern Afrin, that the Turks could not tolerate any further. Many of the Syrians have said that maybe if the U.S. has chosen this ally to be the ally for the fighting ISIS, it may not necessarily be the correct ally for the security and stability and reestablishing peace. And that's been the demand of the majority of the Syrian people, regardless of which camp they stand on.
What's interesting about that is there's been a failure to build a Sunni Arab force in Iraq to counter a Sunni insurgent group, and there's been the same failure in Syria, an 80% country, to build a Sunni force to hold and clear territory from a Sunni insurgent group or terrorist group. And in both cases, we've used proxies. In the case of Iraq, Hashd al-Shabi, Shia militia proxies, and a predominantly heavily Bashar-infiltrated Iraqi security forces. And if you hadn't had a chance, any of you Iraq followers had a chance to look at ISW's Order of Battle report, it's excellent. It goes through each unit to include the Hashd al-Shabi. Jennifer was part of that. I loosely translated that with my iPad pen on my iPad Pro because it's a toy, and plotted all those units on the map. And it shows you the Iran land bridge that we're saying doesn't exist. And in that, it just simply shows control of the 4 major crossing areas by units that have already been co-opted by Badr and also the Hashd al-Shabi. But to your point, we haven't built the right force in Iraq or Syria, and these forces care about issues. The YPG cares about what happens in Afrin. The Hashd al-Shabi cares about what happens in Sinjar, Talafar, and all these other places where there's infrastructure, and we're starting to witness that. And in the case of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, there's potential security backslide. In the case of Kirkuk and Hawija, there's already security backslide with a reemergence of ISIS. And the worst part of that is when ISIS attacks a directly linked IRGC militia, people actually don't care. They don't cheer it necessarily.
Of a specific event, Mike?
A specific event of 27 Asab Ahl-Haq militia members being killed south of Kirkuk by ISIS. There's almost a consensus that, well, they shouldn't have been there. And that's not the right security force. So in that dilemma, we have the U.S. trying to take a position, but like you said, Iran is already winning. Turkey is winning. Nobody's really stopping Turkey. And at this point,
Russia as well. Russia's winning.
Russia takes a dip in the pool of winning and then takes it out right away. And it's just kind of trying to assess what they should do. But yes, I would say Turkey, Iran, and Russia are winning, and the U.S. is struggling to come up with a post-ISIS strategy while still being in an counter-ISIS strategy. Because again, ISIS only lost territory. They're not defeated. They're in the Al-Qaeda model. And
I would say all of this is true, but now I think whether we're winning or losing, it depends on winning at what. I mean, we still don't know what it is we're trying to accomplish. after defeating the Islamic State, because we didn't know what we were trying to accomplish before that. And but I do want to, and that's it's a reasonable discussion. But all these other things then impinge. After that, we're just simply reacting. We're reacting to the fact that, oh yes, we know, yes, we don't like Iran, and we have every good reason not to like Iran. We should resist it and resist it. Everyone has been saying that for God knows how long. But what does that mean in terms of a real objective?
It's in the president's
and it comes up especially now because, powerfully because, we have seen, first of all, that there's been no decline in Iranian ambitions since the conclusion of the JCPOA, so that we're now nearly 3 years after that. But the flip side of that is we actually have a position from which to do something if that's what we intend to do. We have a position in northeast Syria. We have a position in southeast Syria, through which the land bridge runs. So the question is that is that position genuinely useful to opposing the Iranians? What are its costs in exercising? What does it mean? I mean, and since part of that is our position in northeast Syria, necessarily comes into play how we are going to treat the Kurds, because we have taken that territory with the Kurds. We have not. We have been a major player in it through boots on the ground and through our Air Force, but they're the people who are holding the territory, and we see how much that means once their friends in Afrin are attacked. Suddenly, people are leaving positions in near Deir ez-Zor, and suddenly that means we have a new problem with the Islamic State. So these things have to be figured out. I want to say something about Turkey at this point. I mean, there's a larger discussion to be had about what it is that President Erdogan wants. If you go by his various statements, I guess the next Ottoman Caliph, ruler of the Middle East, and so forth, he is very fulsome in his rhetoric and so forth. But as far as the Kurdish issue is concerned, and especially Afrin, what his only argument, the argument he makes is that Turkey was under a terrorist attack from Kurdish regions. The only real argument is it might be under terrorist attack in the future, because there were no such attacks. There really weren't. And then the issue would be, so this action is not in response to anything, it's a preemptive action for which the original pretext that he's fighting terrorism is completely bogus, particularly bogus because he didn't fight terrorism in the form of the Islamic State. He was entirely an enabler for a long time of the Islamic State. So those arguments don't count whatsoever. The real question is, for us, and also for him, how tough we're willing to be with him in order to get him to come to reasonable terms. Because right now his terms are entirely, stated terms, are entirely unreasonable.
So U.S. leverage against our Turkey NATO ally. I'd like to hear each of you tell the audience what are U.S. levers when it comes to Turkey, what can we do, what should we do, and what will we not be able to do? What should we do?
Right. Well, the other thing is, when we talk about U.S. interest, Iraq is a major part. It might be a bigger part. So we have to analyze the situation in Iraq. And right now, while there is chaos, there is lack of leadership in Iraq, the Iraqi election is approaching on May 12th, and this is going to be even much, much more problematic and, quite frankly, a nightmare for the US, because what we see now, if we go to the polls tomorrow, then no political party will win outright, and then there will be a coalition to form the government. In order for all these political parties in this political cacophony to get together, it's almost impossible. Whether we are going to see a political vacuum in Iraq, and areas will be protected by local people or by sectarian groups or by Syrian militias. This is very likely. So if Iraq turned out to be more problematic and more chaos, then there will be a power vacuum there. So Turkey and Iran are the major players in the region where they could come in and hold positions, and looking at their interests and their proxies. So what we can do now, still, America can change the direction of the political establishment, change the direction of the countries in Iraq and Syria, particularly in Iraq. While America is abandoning its friends and allies, people who helped America to achieve their objectives, defeating ISIS and so forth. And while America is not helping the very people who are trying to bring peace and stability about, like the Kurds, while America is not supporting the case for Kurdish rule, what we see now, the Kurdish airports are now controlled by Iraqi government, but also very importantly, the border crossing in the triangle between Syria, Iraq, and Turkey are controlled by Iraqis. And when we say Iraqis in today's context, we mean militias who are aligned to Iran. So these main borders are controlled by Iran. So we are, by not supporting the Kurds, we are losing more leverage, and also it's becoming a headache and a nightmare. And if we go like that, I think it will be Iraq and Syria will be the same nightmare for America.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yes, and you didn't mention a point that you brought up earlier in our discussion. I think is really very crucial about the elections, that it is extremely likely that there will be practically no effective Sunni vote in those elections, which will return us to the situation of 2014 or 2013.
While you have all Shia militias in Mosul and areas, most refugees are not returning to Mosul, and Sunni votes are coming from Mosul mainly. So the Sunnis are trying to delay the Iraqi election to September so they could see the refugees going back. But if this is not going to happen, because other Shia blocs are against the idea. The Shia blocs who are against the idea are people who think they are going to win the election, mainly Maliki and also the Hadi al-Amri Fatah party, which is the main bloc of the Shia militia. So, yeah.
Which will mean we will get ISIS 2.0, ISIS 3.0, whatever. It will make the what seems to have been at least an effective action on the part of the United States to defeat the Islamic State, it will be vitiated to some degree. I don't know.
Lack of this clarity post-ISIS Iraq was led to this chaos, and now Kurds are much, much weaker, which are the main ally on the ground for the United States, and it's going to lead to more chaos and bloodshed, I'm afraid.
And the U.S. position is to hold the elections on May 12th, by the way. Yeah. You want to say something, Dr. Ammar?
Yes, I want to describe the post-ISIS Syria, at least, and perhaps also Iraq, has witnessed a huge increase in the power of Iran. And I think that's where the U.S. policy has gone
Is that a concern of Turkey?
I think you can see it as a concern because most of the weapons used in Afrin by the YPG were Iranian weapons. The Euphrates Shield area has cleaned up it's perhaps the only ISIS zone in Syria. The southern front still has a pocket of ISIS. The northeast Syria still has small pockets. The Euphrates Shield has been the most stable. It has 16 local councils elected by the local communities. The Afrin already has a local council now recently elected, regardless of its power or strength in terms of its governance, but has established something for the move forward. Over 100,000 Syrians have returned to the Euphrates Shield area. I have someone in the regions of Afrin also taking pictures of people returning, not to the large numbers yet, but we haven't seen stability brought back to Raqqa, for example. We haven't seen stability. In fact, we have pockets of Iranian influence in Bukamal, in Deir ez-Zor, and it's always this, the northeast Syria is not a a stable one from a counterterrorism perspective. It's not a stable area in terms of countering Iran's narrative. Something needs to be done. I mean, at the end of the day, Syrian Kurds are Syrians, and they have a right to protect, whether it's the autonomy or a decentralized form of government, whether political or administrative. That's something to be negotiated among the local populations. But I think one of the things that could be brought forward is an opportunity for the U.S. and Turkey to work together, is to establish some form of governance structure, a decentralized governance structure. Now, obviously, that leaves the big elephant in the room, which is Assad. But at least those areas that are controlled by the NATO allies would be enforced in a security architecture that allows Kurds to control their zones without a certain political party to dominate. I mean, you look at the local elections, if any, in the northeast Syria in last September, where 40% of the seats are reserved for the political party of the PYD, the TEP local democratic movement, and then the other 60% have to be cleared by their security agencies. So this is very similar to the Ba'ath Party Assad elections. I'm not saying the elections in the Euphrates Shield are perfect either, but nevertheless, there is no dominating political party that enforces who wins and who doesn't. Local police in areas should be chosen by the local councils, and so they need to be coherent with the local community. One of the lost opportunities has been the referendum in North Iraq. Unfortunately, I mean, the impact of it on Syria is that the trained Peshmerga Syrian Kurds that were trained by the U.S. in the KRG have not been put to force in perhaps the Afrin operation. I mean, certainly the people of Afrin would prefer to have Kurdish forces come to their region rather than Free Syrian Army that have a lot of vengeance and revenge feelings against the region because of many wars between them in the past. But this was a lost opportunity, and I think there's still a chance to mitigate this realignment within northeast Syria without selling out the Kurds for sure. But perhaps a realignment with, you know, the PYD needs to declare keep distance to draw the line with PKK, and all foreign forces need to be pushed out in the same way that we want all foreign forces, if any, in the Free Syrian Army to vacate, to leave, to create a safe passage for them to leave. The foreign fighters in northeast Syria certainly need to also find a way to go back to their homes if security is established. If the threat of ISIS has been, for the most part, removed, with a few pockets remaining, in order to strengthen this area, the Iranian pockets need to be removed. And the Iranian pockets come perhaps for the most part through the PKK channels. I'm not saying PKK has a direct channel to Iran, but it certainly has links. And the links have been seen. And I think Iran has the most to lose in this realignment. I mean, Iran has pushed so much in Afrin against Turkey. And you see how many trips the foreign minister made to Iran from Turkey. And there seems to be something that is unspoken. That's something for the U.S. to invest and perhaps widen that disagreement.
Were you suggesting that Iraqi American-trained Peshmerga could have been transferred to Afrin to defend Afrin?
No, there were Syrian Peshmergas that are now within the refugee camps in the KRG region. Syrian Kurds, okay. Turkey and U.S. trained basically
right.
Syrian
KDP,
Peshmergas.
Yeah, and then KDP Peshmerga went and helped with Kobani and other places as well. Right. Jennifer?
Sure. I would just add that I do agree that the U.S. will fail to reclaim Turkey effectively from a current alignment with the Russo-Iranian coalition until or unless the U.S. resets the terms of this negotiation. The United States has been involved in both, I would argue, Iraq and Syria, has been involved enough to be accountable, but not enough actually to dictate terms, either to allies like Turkey, but even to our local partner, the YPG. We've attempted to prevent them actually from deploying reinforcements west of the Euphrates to fight the Turks. We couldn't do that. We're going to fail to preclude the YPG from escalating in a variety of possible ways, to include actually that they will decide to start conducting operations inside of Turkey. We've seen them claim one operation inside of Turkey on social media, a post they subsequently took down, but they put it out there. And so the United States is not actually acting like a power broker inside of Syria. So nobody is responding to the United States as if we are a power broker inside of Syria. And until or unless that changes, we're not, I don't think, going to be able to reclaim the Turks. And we're not going to be able to exploit very important common areas of interest with Turkey, which include countering the Assad regime, which include constraining Iran and reducing Iran's buildup inside of Syria, which should include developing a post-ISIS form of governance that can bridge between local populations that the Turks support, including Free Syrian Army constituencies in northwestern Syria, and local populations in areas that the U.S. has reclaimed. These are all opportunities for the U.S. to assert leadership. The United States' unwillingness to be involved in Syria in the first place, however, has precluded the United States from actually exploiting any of these opportunities, and has therefore constrained the U.S. and forced us to just respond tactically to every latest series of escalations.
Right. What's interesting, I'll get right to you. What's interesting about that is General Votel was testifying in front of Congress, and Senator Lindsey Graham pressed him. So what are we doing in Syria? What about Iran? Are we doing anything to counter Iran? And he kept pushing him, and General Votel said, my mission in Syria is to defeat ISIS. Right. And it goes against the national security strategy that the White House put out. It goes against what we talk about when we say it's not defeat, it's defeat ISIS and curb Iranian influence. And wow, look how far Iran has actually been, how much they've been able to achieve in Syria with the rockets and the missiles and the Hezbollah presence in southern Syria, as their zero faces two fronts. So there's a lot going on, but I think that kind of defines it when General Votel said that. Our mission isn't to do anything in Syria other than to defeat ISIS. And we all agree that needs to change.
This brings to mind, oh, I'm sorry.
No.
I was just going to say, it stems from our unwillingness to go into Syria in the first place, way back, when we could have, after all, have created a Sunni Arab force that was a substantial force. And then when we finally decided to do a little bit, we did nonsense, pure nonsense. But it hasn't, the way it worked out, whatever President Obama thought at the beginning, it worked out that we are there, and in a big way. So there is, and I agree with you, this is incoherent. We don't have a policy. We don't know what we want to accomplish. I mean, in general, we would like Iraq to be nice and Syria to be nice and Turkey to be nice, but none of that is going to actually happen unless we have a clear vision of what endpoint we could reasonably seek and what the means are to it. And that's what we need to do at present. And I do think we have to consider other things. Any future action on our part, and this is one way in which the Syria-Iraq thing are always tied together, has to do with the fact that there are Kurds in Iraq and Kurds in Syria, as well as Kurds in Iran and Kurds in Turkey. And if we mean to do something in the future in the Middle East, perhaps we will continue our withdrawal from it. But if we mean to do something, that depends on trust and faith in ourselves and our actions and so forth. And that was already at a low point at the beginning of this administration, and it goes still lower if people see that when it's convenient, we make an alliance with Kurds to help us with the Islamic State. When it's not convenient, we abandon them. Or similarly with other allies. If the Sunnis in Iraq see that, well, it was convenient for us to be in Iraq when we were fighting the Islamic State, but now it's not, and we're abandoning them to the Shiites again. All of those things that are there. So
we have a thank you and masalama strategy, which isn't working.
All right.
Yeah, I think one more thing we haven't mentioned is that this demographic change that it's taking place in Syria. So this attack on Afrin, maybe it's in a longer term, it's to do with demographic change, because the North Shield, there is also this idea of demographic change. But also the Assad regime,
people would be population replacement.
Yeah, because of all the refugees from Turkey to return back, but also demographic change. It's not only taking place by the outside forces, but also by inside forces. Look at Syria. How many people have been issued citizenship who are not Syrians? They are brought by Iranians fighting in Syria, and also by Hezbollah in Lebanon, fighting in Syria on behalf of Assad regime, and they are getting citizenships, Syrian citizenships. So maybe this is also going to, Afrin in the long term will be a big demographic change in the
so it'd be a model for ethnic cleansing and so forth.
It looks that way. It's a reshaping in terms of not only political ideology, but also population and ethnicities.
And that's something you and I talked about a couple of days ago. We talked about this is a strategy. Basically, this is a template for changing the demographics in a place and then having elections afterwards to where it actually favors you. And who is that gentleman that we should all know that's buying up all the property in southern Syria? Oh, we should put on. Everybody should remember this name because he's going to be
Samer Foz.
Yes.
Is he Syrian?
Yes.
Okay.
He's one of the covers for the recent huge purchases of land in Damascus and in many areas in Syria, actually.
By Iran.
Allegedly or supposedly, I assume by Iran, yes.
Mm. Yes, if we can say YPG, PKK, we can say this guy and IRGC pretty easily. Yeah. What's his name again?
Samer Foz.
Samer Foz.
Samer Foz. OFAC, U.S. Treasury. Roger, got it.
Somebody Google that.
So anyway, we're talking about these demographic shifts. We're talking about all the things that are taking place. And some of that's happening in Kirkuk as well.
It's happening in Kirkuk, the process with demographic change, it started with the Ba'ath Party in 1980s. And until now, it's taking place. With all this Hajj Shabi coming there and buying properties, and there are several names in Kirkuk again, so it seems like you said it's a template. It's in Syria and Iraq.
Yeah, you see the demographic shift in Baghdad after we came in.
All the Shias,
it's what happens.
The other point is, so many times we hear a lot in the media and also on public gatherings that U.S. weapons ended up used by the PKK, because effectively when they went to the YPG, then they were used by PKK. But look at Iraq, for example. All this money that the U.S. spent to rebuild the Iraqi forces and Iraqi army, which was destroyed in the matter of 24 hours when ISIS came in. We lost billions of dollars rebuilding the army and all the armament and machines. And also, during the fight against ISIS, America gave all these weapons to the Iraqi army, ended up being used by the Hajj Shabi.
Right, they have
Hajj Shabis. And then now we see the same machines we have evidence that same guns and machines are used by the Quds forces and some people in Iran and also in Syria. So it's not something, what we see with the YPG and how they use the American weapons, it's not something just confined to them. It's also with other forces. So it goes back to the idea that there is lack of clarity in our objectives from the Western point of view when it comes to tackling Iran or rebuilding Iraq, tackling Iran and rebuilding Iraq and Syria. There is lack of clarity, lack of objectives in this matter.
The most interesting thing I'll say about that is the access to U.S. money and U.S. equipment. We had evidence that Asab al-Haq was being able to use M1 Abrams tanks. These weren't captured tanks on the battlefield. These were tanks not requested from the MOD, not asked for, but said, we need 2 tanks. And they basically allocated OPCON to the IRGC Quds Force militias under the Hashd al-Shabi. Now, in the last month, Prime Minister Abadi has actually brought in Kitab Hezbollah, Asab al-Haq, Harakat Nujayba, all these different militias. Badr is already there into the official Iraqi military, which means now you actually have these units that have access to U.S. training equip funds. and it's a violation of the Leahy law. It's something we're looking at. And what we did when we saw human rights abuses from Shia militias back during the surge, is we had a thing called blue training. We were able to take a unit out of the field, put it into an American base, bring in the human rights, lawyers. People talk about the rules of engagement, basically clear out bad apples. But you can do that when you have 160,000 people on the ground. You can't do that when you have 2,000 people on the ground in Syria and 5,000 in Iraq.
I don't quite understand this though. Everyone likes American tanks.
Right.
We make very good ones. If the Hashd is now officially in the Iraqi army, which it is, which happening, which in a way we also even asked for, that we wanted them brought under the control of the government. In what way is it illegitimate for them to be operating our equipment? They're part of the Iraqi army.
Qais Khazali, for example, if you look
it's a ridiculous thing, but it's not.
Qais Khazali, the leader of the Hasab al-Haq, if you look at his tweets every day, he has tons of tweets threatening American soldiers with American weapons that he possesses now.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem is that we are now viewing it as legitimate for Iran to use Iraqi forces with Iraqi government resources to deploy, for example, into Syria and attack U.S. forces.
Right.
That's the reality that we've created by having no strategic vision, actually, for what comes after ISIS and for being unwilling to put any constraints on Iran's ability to penetrate Iraqi institutions while we focused on that tactical fight.
We're also losing the strategic comms game, because our strategic communication strategy is to say none of that is happening.
Right.
And there's evidence on the ground that it's happening. It just needs to change. It's the one Iraq strategy, set aside the Kurdish independence or Kurdish referendum. The attack on the KRG territory was going to happen anyway. And the referendum was used as an excuse to do it. It was going to happen anyway. I've been to Iraq numerous times as a civilian in my research capacity here, and you would always hear Hashim al-Shabi say, Badul Daesh intum, after ISIS, you guys. And this was before the referendum. This is before the Kurds were even thinking about doing a referendum, because they were gauging the U.S. response. But this shouldn't happen. There's a thing called DDR, demobilize, disarm, and integrate. And this is not that, but it's being touted as that, Jennifer, bringing them into the Iraqi security forces and saying they now fall under the control of the prime minister, when Hadi al-Amri and Mohandes will say, we don't listen to the prime minister, and we will actually
decide. They may control the government after the next election. So
it's very true, because if you look at the history of Iraq, it's always been military coups, and the biggest force in Iraq now are Hashd al-Shabi. Without Hashd al-Shabi, there is no Iraq. With Hashd al-Shabi, that means Iran is in control of Iraq. And it's a possibility. But also, in the Iraqi election, what we see in the Iraqi parliament, we see people like Qais Khazali, like Mohandes, like Hadi Amri, inside the biggest Iraqi institution. And imagine what will happen after that. I can predict nothing but chaos and more bloodshed.
During the surge, the strategy of Baghdad, and I'll just say this real quick, was to prevent a Sunni return to power. So they're focused on Ba'athis. And then after Al-Qaeda was decimated, Dawa party started being concerned about Jaish al-Mahdi, started being concerned about Badr Corps, and started using Kitab Hezbollah and Asab al-Haq to marginalize them. Badr seems to have won that fight with Maliki stepping down. Hadi al-Amri has seemed to have won that fight and has now co-opted Qais Khazali, Mohandes. Maybe not co-opted. Soleimani has said all three of you will work together.
Yeah.
This is the goal. So the irony is that the regime protection forces, we could actually build a national military absent sectarian ties to any political parties if the threat was a sectarian threat from Iran. And that narrative just hasn't been tried. Anyway, back to Syria.
Yeah, I wanted to ask our Syrian colleague, you were suggesting that the most plausible policy to pursue in Syria is a decentralization policy at the moment. And that would be, that would put us obviously directly in conflict with Assad and Iran and putatively Russia. So how do you see this? This would involve, this is where you see the potential cooperation between us and Turkey, is that it?
Well, I don't necessarily see Russia objecting to decentralization.
They might not either, yes, yeah.
And so, at least if the three of the main armies present on the ground have something in common, even though it's not complete, and of course I would put the Russians as being not a very stable ally in this, of course, but nevertheless, I think Iran would be then the only one that's to lose. At least that could be mitigated through other means. But what's happening today is that we have multiple governance structures, multiple security apparatuses being built. And just like Michael mentioned, the issue of perhaps building really a professional army, whether, you know, it does not need to be called an army, but it could be with a structured fashion.
All Syrian army?
It's not sectarian based, meaning it's not SDF and it's not FSA. It's something that combines both and takes into consideration the local populations, and it's structured in a professional type. Like you know, the Russians proposed a fifth corps. It's still a failure in that sense. But why can't this be done in northeast Syria and northwest Syria on the security, but also on the governance? I think there is already a de facto decentralization today. There is a de facto decentralization in northeast Syria, in northwest, and in the south also. And so I think there is an opportunity to have these governed perhaps on militarily under a new structured army. So you can call it an SDF 2.0, Syrian Democratic Forces, or an FSA 2.0 or so, where it bypasses these issues of sectarian lines. In parallel to that, you need you know, talking about DDR, you know, Jordan has done that in forming security forces, local security forces in some of the areas in the southern front. Turkey has done that, and also the U.S. has done that to some extent in northeast Syria. So those are security apparatuses that has taken a lot of the fighters to become more civilian type security, or local police even. So that's one of the forms of DDR that could start from now and not wait till the end of the resolution of the conflict. And then the third would be the actual administration. Today you have a totally incoherent type of administration on the northeast, the education sector. You know, we've done numerous field studies on the education sector where many Kurdish residents are either sending their kids to regime areas or maybe fleeing out of the region. The number of Kurds, for example, that flew out of the northeast Syria, even after the liberation of the exit of ISIS, about a third of Syrian refugees to Germany are Kurds from northeast Syria. Why? I mean, some of them have flew out because of ISIS, but I know thousands of people that we've surveyed that said, you know, there is no stability. There's no. I have a staff member whose daughter was kidnapped and was 16 and is now serving within those armed groups, the Women Protection Services. And so there are numerous issues that local populations, Kurds, Christian, Arab, of all sorts, and especially, you know, when you talk about demographic change, talk about demographic change also in northeast Syria, not only in Damascus suburbs or in other areas, in whether it's in Afrin or others. Northeast Syria has witnessed a huge population shift of people going, you know, out to Turkey, to Europe, to other countries, or people going to other regime-held areas.
I think the U.S., if I may, is in denial about this. The reality that the areas that we've recaptured from ISIS are not well governed. To the extent that there is governing services or a governance structure, it is repressive and excludes political competition from other Kurdish parties, for example, like the ones that the Turks back. But that in general, actually, what the U.S. is de facto building or allowing to be built in these areas we've recaptured could actually ultimately lead to a return of the Ba'ath Party, which we've already started to see on lower levels in places like Manbij. And so the U.S. is just in complete denial about the fact that our presence in this terrain somehow serves inherently a counter-Assad or counter-Iranian function. There's nothing inherent about that, actually. And if the U.S. continues to refuse to gain control of the situation, that may actually be where we end up.
It's interesting. The president said, well, we hear that the president said, "Do not give me my own war." And I think that when you ask not to have your own war and you ignore everything that's going on around you, you get it anyway. And you.
President Obama certainly.
Yes, there's a precedent.
Yeah, President Obama got his war in Iraq. President Trump could have his war in any number of places, based on the current geopolitical tensions.
It has the very great advantage that you can then, complain that it was forced on me. I didn't choose this.
Exactly.
And that, since the Iraq War, any war of choice has become absolutely a no-no. That is, from a public point of view, an advantage. But I would like to go back to...
Well, real quick, just to finish my point. Those wars are in the future.
Right.
This war, we're already, 6 months behind? 8 months behind? and that's the difference between Iraq and Syria, is we keep ignoring what's going on, and we still get our own war, except we are already 6 months to a year behind everybody else. Right. In the case that you're talking about, they haven't started yet, and if this template is something that's carried forward, we'll be behind then as well.
I wanted to just not let the suggestion you were making before drop. It sounds like what you would, in a way propose is a negotiation in which the present state of play, where everyone is on the ground, well, allowing for some adjustments, because we're not going to stop Assad in East Ghouta, so that's a done deal. But even, I don't know what you think about Idlib, but that we would get to a sort of stand-in-place ceasefire, and then the negotiation would be basically about, in a way, blessing that arrangement, whereby we have our zone, Turks have their zone, Assad has his own, Russia has its interests. Where Iran fits in this, I'm not sure, but essentially the negotiations would be, something like the negotiations among occupying powers after other kinds of wars, in which there's a multiple occupation and you come to some settlement. Is that what you think would follow from this?
I probably wouldn't use the word blessing.
Yes, blessing it's not, but...
but we have a de facto situation that we want to make sure that it does not escalate into further insecurity, further breaches of whether it's ISIS or Iran or other forces. So I'm saying this is not the ideal situation, but it's already a de facto,
right.
And we want to make sure that it is consolidated, it is secure, and then you could actually negotiate with Assad a certain settlement. The peace process would have more prospects if you have, in my opinion, and I know this is disagreed upon in the literature, that in post-conflict areas, a decentralized system might be a catalyst for a political process to go into. Many Syrians, whether it's Syria is very localized and culturally speaking, and so this is not only it's not only the Kurds that want some form of an autonomy, regardless of how the range of that autonomy is defined. But in many regions, people don't want to belong to a central government that used to, control their lives to the maximum. For someone to get married, they need to get a permit from Damascus. This is a very, very intrusive system of government that no one wants to, including people on the regime side. So, one of the prospects today has been to actually communicate with local councils on the regime side that have loose connections, still allies with Assad, but have loose connections, meaning they have more autonomous types. And there are areas, villages and cities and regions in regime areas that are stable, but nevertheless people are not happy that they don't have this autonomy. So, this could actually instigate, this could actually, people would become jealous in those regions of the regime, saying, now that the war is over, and the regime has regained many areas in Syria, nevertheless, these pockets are still within, whether it's Turkish or U.S. control. People in regime areas would be jealous of that settlement, although not ideal, not a blessed one, but something that could perhaps be developed and be invested in.
So as we look at the new additions to the administration, with Pompeo going to state and Ambassador Bolton going to the National Security Council, the argument we've heard, I think, here in D.C., the D.C. conversation, is that we can't focus on everything. And in that, we've seen security backslide in Iraq, we've seen Syria get out of control as we focus on North Korea, or we focus on other issues. Do you think with this change in the administration, whether you're engaging it from the outside or as you see it in Iraq and of course here in the DC conversation, do you think this is on their radar, these changes in Syria? I know it should be, but the argument again is we can't focus on everything. I think they're focused on
focus on everything.
Well,
what would be the other foci?
Well, they're focused on the Iran deal and they're focused on North Korea. The previous NSC was focused on North Korea and not the Iran deal, and not Iraq, and not Syria, but on North Korea. So, at least was the conversation. So, what do you think? Just 2 minutes to each panelist. What you think this new administration or this new team that's in, and I think the president has as a surge strategy. He puts teams together for specific events, and he thinks that they can get the best out of a team for a year. So McMaster was a counter-ISIS, part of the counter-ISIS team, and this new team coming in is the counter-JCPOA, counter-Iran, counter-North Korea team. So I'll just ask each panelist to just take 2 minutes to see what you think these changes mean, what it looks like 6 months down the road. Do we have 6 months down the road? You know, all these things that are happening. And the Iran deal is likely to be canceled as early as mid-April, and if not, after May 12th. And the impacts on what Iran is able to do, the impacts on Russia now that Iran can't afford to buy its expensive equipment anymore, things like that. I mean, just if you can, tie it up for me. Sorry about the long question, but help me out here. 2 minutes each. I'm just kidding, go.
Well, interestingly, what we see in Iraq, for example, from Iraq's perspective, what we read in the newspapers, in Kurdish areas of Iraq, people are optimistic that finally there will be people who will say no to Iran. And Iraqi side, what we see in the newspapers, what people talk about, because it's the main subject of talk now in Iraq, these two changes with Pompeo and with John Bolton, is that there is a fear these people are hardliners and they are going to back away from the Iran deal, and also finally they will say no to Iran, and they will take a steep or very directive action against Iraq. That's what we read in the newspapers in Iraq, and I think it's, to some extent, even here, people believe that this team put together because the Iran deal is approaching in April or May, middle of May, then it's likely that America is going to withdraw from the deal. But how they deal with the Europeans while they're part of the deal with Iran, this is something to be seen. In terms of, from the Israeli perspective, they are very optimistic now that Iran will be dealt with. Again, from that perspective, this change in administration is something positive that they've been waiting for.
And the drop in Iranian currency kind of reflects that optimism on this side of the border, a drop in currency on the other side of the border with these changes.
And interestingly, in Iraq, Iranians are now buying lots of American dollars. You know, exchanging their money there, trying to buy American notes, taking them.
Well, when it's 50,000 rials to the dollar, yes. Yeah.
Doctor?
Well, I mean, from a Syrian perspective, two incidents really hurt the Syrian cause. One was the deal with Russia on the chemical weapons, and the second has been the nuclear agreement with Iran. The nuclear agreement provided lots of cash, lots of attention, diverted attention away from all the crimes of Iran, and also empowered Iran to become more powerful. And I think this would change the rules of the game. But even if that doesn't happen, I think it's important to counter Iran, perhaps in the same way that it tries to export all the problems to other countries. Those need to, I mean, there has to be some tying of those bolts on the Iranian presence in Syria and Iraq, of course.
Right.
I think my concluding recommendation is that the United States needs to recognize that Syria and Iraq, increasingly, are actually theaters where great power conflict is most likely, if not already unfolding. And the Russians are in a coalition with the Iranians that is pursuing shared objectives in Syria, the wider Middle East, and other places to include Afghanistan. So I think the United States does need to implement a counter-Iran policy. We need to have our eyes wide open about the possibility, actually, that the Russians will use their instruments of power to support the Iranians to confront the United States. And I think we need to admit that we have thousands of American servicemen and women at risk in Iraq and Syria right now, with no strategy actually to translate their hard-earned gains and their sacrifices into an enduring outcome. That's just not acceptable American leadership.
Right.
So we need to rectify that situation.
To some extent, also American soldiers in Turkey in the Angel League base. So it's very uncertain now. And
yeah.
I agree with those comments, and I want to say about first, I think we'll have to see what the leadership of Pompeo and Bolton is. I'm pretty sure that many of the negative things said about them are nonsense, and they're not simply looking for wars to fight. What's really, I think, unfortunate at the moment, for a reason that was implied in what Jennifer just said, is the degree to which the attention will be focused on the JCPOA. It is as bad a deal or worse than the president says, and Bolton and Pompeo say, and other people say. It's just not the most urgent issue. The most urgent issue is what happens right now in Iraq and Syria. And, obviously, if we withdraw from the JCPOA, he will certainly give the impression that we are going to be much tougher on Iran than we have been. And that overall is a good thing, but whether it's followed by any steps that are really concretely very hard in Iraq and in Syria is another question. And that's where the battle is presently joined, and that's where we have people in harm's way. So I think all of this may lead eventually, precisely because we do have people in harm's way, and we will face choices which may be tough. Should we increase somehow our investment in the region or not? If we're not, then we'll pull out and continue. This will continue a kind of momentum, and then we will finally see that famous pivot to Asia that was rooted in the last administration.
What's interesting about what you said is there was a test, October 13th. We had a panel here at the Hudson Institute. We stopped it, and the president was carried live here, and he designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in its entirety as a terrorist organization for supporting these destabilizing events in Iraq and Syria through the Quds Force. And yet, 60 hours later, Qasem Soleimani used U.S. equipment, Iranian proxies, and attacked an ally. And there was no response from the United States other than it didn't happen.
And we didn't see it happen.
We didn't see it happen. Even though you showed us pictures of burning tanks, we didn't see it happen. But a lot of that has changed now. We've now recognized what is going on in Iraq vis-a-vis Iran. But again, it's like you said, if we walk away from the Iran deal the day after, I think we have leverage in Iraq, and that's a separate panel. We're going to be doing that panel April 4th or 5th on what happens the day after the JCPOA, what happens the day after the Iraqi elections on May 12th, because of the JCPOA, how they're tied together. Okay, I'd like to, again, we started late, 107, and we're going to go to 137. So if you want to stick around, but I'd like to open it up
Army
to
precision.
Questions. Yes, I want to open it up to questions, but what I would ask is you wait for one of our Hudson interns to show up. You state your name, you stand up, and try to limit your questions to questions, and we'll be able to take as many as we can. All right, we'll start with this gentleman here. Good to see you.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an intel analyst and a former diplomat. At some point, congressmen are going to realize, speaking of American weaponry, that there are now dead Kurdish babies thanks to American planes carrying American bombs, running against American imagery with 2 decades of knowledge derived from American signals intelligence coming out of Incirlik and Cyprus. At what point do those congressmen start turning off the tap of American technology? And at what point does the president call up General Dynamics and say, no more phone calls from Turkey?
I'm sorry, but turn off the tap to whom?
To the Turks, who are using American equipment and American intelligence to kill our allies.
Right, so the way I want to do this, I want to take about 4 questions and then have the panelists, whoever thinks they can answer it best. Yes, sir? A gentleman in the beard?
Yeah.
To you, Lauren, I'll get back here. course.
Pat Span, just myself, although I was in Baghdad in '04 with the OGA.
Okay.
But anyway, I wonder if the panel could think strategically for a minute. And we're coming up on 100 years of the national borders of the areas we're talking about, and it seems like it's outlived its usefulness. What do you see as an end game that actually will see a change in the national borders, within the next 5-10 years or something like that? It just seems like I blame. See, my family I have an Irish background, so I blame everything on the English and French anyway. But they definitely screwed up in that part of the world.
I suggest we only fight wars in Central America where everyone's Catholic and Latino and there's no more sectarian issues. I'll go to Lori here and then I'll come.
Lori Milroy, Kurdistan 24. My question was actually a version of the previous question, and I'd like to formulate it like this. Maybe we need to stop talking about Iraq and Syria. They are failed entities created 100 years ago for colonial powers for the interests of colonial powers, and start talking about communities. I mean, it seems that Iran, Syria, even Turkey to some extent recognize this, and they're manipulating populations, as you've said, underneath these hollowed out shells of things we call states that don't really exercise authority. So my suggestion, stop thinking in terms of Iraq and Syria and start thinking in terms of communities, and does that make sense to you?
Okay, well, one more question and then we'll go to the second set. To the gentleman right here with his glasses and the mustache, Min Shawarab Saidi.
My name is Jabbar Ja'far from Voices for Iraq. In fact, I have a comment on Mr. Nahro. It's not a question. So, can I talk now or?
No, we'll save it for afterwards. We're going to do questions. Are you gonna?
I want to comment on it because he tried to
Yeah, I don't want to get into a.
Right.
We want to ask questions. No, the stage isn't for that. Thank you, though. But I'll get back to you afterwards. All right, we had a question right behind with glasses.
Sarah Stern, Endowment for Middle East Truth. Many times Turkey has been referred to as an ally, a NATO ally. You know that NATO was created in 1949. It was a 20th century organization to defeat the Soviets during the Cold War. Our greatest threat right now is no longer the Soviet Union, which I think has collapsed. I've heard many times over the last 6 months constraints from supporting the Kurds because Turkey is a NATO ally. Is it time to re-examine the utility of NATO?
Is it time? All right, great. All right, you want to try to answer those 4 questions? So the first question is, should we allow Turkey to use U.S. technology to punish U.S. temporary allies? That's just the nature of this war. The Saudis are doing the same thing. We're doing the same thing. I'll just take it. Okay, if I take that one on real quick. We're using American technology. Everyone's using technology, and a lot of it is American. The biggest problem is it's U.S. policy, at least it has been prior to this accelerated ISIS strategy to take back territory, that the only time you drop U.S. steel on target is if you have U.S. eyes watching it. And we've outsourced our eyes, meaning we are using proxy forces. And these proxy forces are sectarian. And there's less concern about a house that could or could not be ISIS or could or, isn't or is not YPG or FSA. So it's not a question of technology, it's a question of rules of engagement, it's a question of military strategy, and specifically, it's a problem with using proxy forces. And we can talk afterwards or we can talk after it. So that's how I want to answer that one.
It's turning off the technology that is given and sold to Turkey.
No, I thought I clarified in the beginning. We're going to sell U.S. technology to NATO allies, and then they're going to use it in ways that we don't find that they're using it the right way. Example, people are criticizing the KSA, people criticize Turkey, and we've been criticized as well for what we've done. So I think, I don't know how you shut that off, but we can talk about this some other time.
I think the issue will have to be resolved in a larger discussion of Turkey, whether, as was implied before, whether by the last question, is Turkey to be considered an ally anymore, or at least a reliable ally, meaning by that having common interests with us, common principles with us, and for that matter, being able to contribute to the alliance. I mean, Turkey has proven to be extremely capable of dropping our ordnance on Afrin and other places. Whether its military is really that good anymore is another question. And the problem will grow. I don't know how Congress is going to deal with this, but they're already a bit pissed by Turkey. There used to be, and probably still is, the Turkish-American caucus in the Congress, but I'll bet it's much smaller now. And for reasons that have to do with things that happen in our own streets. When he brings his security guard here, they behave like thugs, which is terrible. And also he behaves like a thug with his own population. So all of that, and that's not going to change in Turkey until Erdogan's gone, because that is the nature of the man and the nature of his objectives and the nature of his vision for himself and the country. So all of that's going to be there down the road, and the issue of the ordinance itself, I think, is only part of that.
So that's question 1 and 4, Jennifer?
Yeah, a brief additional comment on NATO, if I may. We can debate this, but the purpose of the NATO alliance has evolved since its formation. The principle of collective security in NATO actually was invoked to support the war effort in Afghanistan against the Taliban and al-Qaeda. NATO is now a member of the global anti-ISIS coalition, which is critical actually for helping Europe and the United States and other parties within that coalition to coordinate in disrupting, for example, ISIS foreign fighter flows into and out of Europe. So the purpose of the NATO alliance has evolved, and we cannot actually separate this issue inside of Syria from the wider involvement actually of Turkey in NATO operations, which include the current United States main effort in Afghanistan. And so I think that is part of why these issues are so complex and why it can't simply be a white and black, should we kick Turkey out of NATO even though there's no mechanism for that, or should we punish them for Syria? We actually have to balance all of these competing issues.
I'll let you handle the Sykes-Picot.
Yeah, I think, the borders are no longer together. They are seen artificial borders. They were artificial, in my view, right from the beginning, but now more so because we see how the dynamic and the demographic change and the political arenas have changed. And Iraq is no longer the same Iraq and never will be the same Iraq, and neither Syria. These are gone. But whether it's going to be a different form of governance, like you suggested, locals are in charge of their own areas and you have weak central governments in Baghdad, in Damascus, or whether going to be different entities. But the idea of, bringing back all Sykes-Picot agreement and all the borders like they used to be, this is no longer viable. You have to spend billions and billions of dollars and you will achieve nothing. And we have an example. Look at Iraq. From Western point of view, from American point of view, they've spent billions of dollars to rebuild Iraq.
To keep it one.
And they failed. And it's no longer viable. It's best to look for other solutions now.
The Sykes-Picot thing is interesting. For ever and a day, I'm an Islamic historian, and very old now in this trade. And people who have been complaining about Sykes-Picot, enlightened opinion, complained about it when Laurie and I were, for example, graduate students some years ago. And always it was, terrible, this terrible agreement. Now enlightened opinion is, no, we actually absolutely have to have Sykes-Picot.
All
right? Because, and then it gets into what the alternatives are. And the alternatives, I don't exactly know what Laurie Milroy means by communities, but it could be not just Shiite Iraq, Sunni Iraq, Kurdish Iraq. It could be
Northern, Western, Central.
All kinds of things. And the problem that always raises for people from the outside is it multiplies, just mathematically multiplies the opportunities for warfare, because each particular community
wants something in the other community
and may not be friendly with it, and it reproduces the situation you had in Europe for a very long time, especially in the 17th century, when there were about, I don't know how many, historian here will remind me or us how many German states there were and how many different combinations there could be in the 30 years war. So that's the objections right off the bat. You'll have you'll reduce the internal conflict, and you'll just export it to the outside. That's all.
You want to say something else?
I mean, I want to say whether, we want NATO or we don't, whether we want the borders or not, Turkey has 950 kilometers. Turkey has boots on the ground. Iran has boots on the ground, and Russia and the U.S. And so whether you want to call it, pick the lesser of two evils, or whether you want to call it something else, depending on how you describe Turkey. But at the end of the day, either you pick Iran as an ally or you pick Turkey as an ally in terms, if you want stability and security in Syria. Now, if we don't want stability and security in Syria, we don't want to safeguard this area from ISIS infiltrations or from further refugee influxes outside, or we want to empower Assad again and so forth. But at the end of the day, there are troops on the ground, and the competing regional powers, I would say, I mean, unless if you want to bring Gulf countries in the picture, right now they're not. But today we have 4 regular armies on the ground. And so from a pure security perspective, regardless if you want to call this, as we've called it, a transactional type, meaning it doesn't have to be a comprehensive type of an alliance, whether NATO or non-NATO, but at the end you need a transaction to stabilize this region.
Time for 2 more questions. This gentleman here, and then we'll go to this gentleman over here.
Herb Rose, considering 2 events that are taking place in May, one the election in Iraq and the other the certification of the JCPOA, there's also a 3rd event taking place in May, and that is discussions between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. Considering that Kim Jong-un has taken certain position, that why would he be expected to change his position at all in consideration of the JCPOA being certified? And would that influence this administration's consideration of certification or not certifying JCPOA?
Can I answer that one?
Absolutely.
So,
go ahead.
I've been in on these what happens the day after conversations. So Kim Jong-un stepped up all of his missile launches during the last year of the Obama administration, in my opinion, in order to get a JCPOA-like deal, one heavily laden with incentives, weak enforcement, allows you to maintain your nuclear program, and has an IAEA that's hesitant to actually inspect sites where we think negative activities are happening. I think the day you walk away from the JCPOA, you knock Kim Jong-un back on his heels, because now he knows he's not going to get a favorable deal like Iran got, and like the one his father got under the Clinton administration that allowed him to become a nuclear power today, that we actually have leverage. And also the bilateral talk leverage, we have that as well, because now we don't have to get our European allies, like we did with the P5+1, to agree to terms, to make concessions to them so that Iran, again, gets a favorable JCPOA. Bilateral talks mean Russia and China can't weigh in on the other side. They can weigh in based on what we can do through our economic levers. But I think the day after is the day we actually gain leverage with both Iran, North Korea, Baghdad, and Damascus, if we do it right.
Sounds like May is a month when you might want to take a vacation someplace without internet.
Unless it's so the last time I took one of those direct questions where, hey, can I go after one of your panelists? I was sitting next to Sebastian Gorka, and I don't want to experience that again. So please, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Timur Eldadiri. I work with the Netherlands Embassy. I had a question, which
embassy?
Netherlands.
Okay, Netherlands.
I was wondering about, there have been some positive signs in Iraq of some kind of emerging Iraqi nationalism, particularly also among the Shia population. And I think some members of your panel already alluded to that a little bit, but I would like to know more about it in the context of the upcoming elections. I mean, is this just wishful thinking? Or is this something that could really become an important force after the elections?
You mind if I give it 30 seconds? We had the Hikma party visit us from Iraq, and they gave us a very positive message. 60% of Iraq's population is under the age of 30. They are not sectarian. They don't want to join the Shia political parties. They are looking for U.S. engagement, economic engagement, educational engagement, and that is promising because this is the Shia population. Again, Iraq is 60% Shia. The Shia youth don't want to go down this road where they're tied to political parties. We're seeing the same thing in Kurdistan. You can talk about that. But I think there are positive places. But I think like any election I've seen in Iraq since we helped get the Constitution in place, is everybody tells the youth, tells these Iraqis, hey, we're going to do everything you want us to do after the election. We just need your vote. And the tribal security councils will give their leaders money. You'll use all these tools to get everybody to vote a certain way. And then much like American politics, after the election, you fail your electorates and you hope to regain them 6 months before the election. Anyway, you want to handle the Kurdish part? Or?
Yeah, I think before this election, the previous election and the one before that, if you look at some of the nationalistic language or literature that the political parties used, for example, Ayad Alawi is one of the Shias who is very popular among the Sunnis, not among the Shia as such. And he's moderate and he's out-looking guy, but he got nowhere. In the end, the deal was between the sectarian groups, albeit Kurdish or Shia, if you look at it in this way. So right now, what we see here, in fact, Iraq under Saddam Hussein was more nationalistic than now. Now it's more a country divided along ethnic and sectarian lines. Look at the institutions, they're all divided among sectarians and ethnic lines. Even in Shia areas in south of Iraq, if you look at the schools, the head of schools or universities, who they are, they have to be aligned to one of the political parties. And this is true. You could translate the same scenario in the middle of Iraq and also north of Iraq. It's a country divided along ethnic and sectarian lines, and the nationalistic language that we see politicians are using are no longer viable. They are not getting anywhere.
I think, I defer to you. I would only add that two things. One is the divisions, this division comes with arms. I mean, the people who have to accept a national view are the ones with arms, and they're not inclined to do so. They're the ones who have the weapons. And second of all, when we met with Hikma, I was very struck by it. It was a very, very smooth and persuasive account. And they left behind some very interesting literature. And when you looked at the literature, it featured a lot of photos, all of them with people in extremely traditional dress and garb, and not in any way reflecting this sort of new, what he in fact explicitly described as a secular youth wave.
Right, right.
So all the women were in black abayas, and all the men were not sporting, and also they were old. I mean, so it would seem very unlikely that this gentleman was deeply in touch with the pulse of the youth. That's what I thought.
Jennifer,
just one thing. Talking about pictures, we see for the Iraqi election, the campaign for Iraqi election, most of the Shia leaders, especially those who are within the PMU, they have their photos, and behind their photos there is a photo of Khamenei or Khomeini of Iran, and you've seen that all. You could search on Facebook or Google it. You see Iraqi politicians, standing in front of either Iranian flag or the photo of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards or supreme leaders.
Sure. All I would say is you can't really have national Iraqi unity without the Sunni population, which has been completely devastated, of course, by the rise of ISIS and then the counter-ISIS operation. And I think the U.S. is in, again, a bit of denial about the fact that these populations may no longer view ISIS as legitimate given the brutality that they endured. But opposition to ISIS does not equal support for the central Iraqi government. So I think we can't actually have true Iraqi unity in any sense until or unless that reconciliation actually happens.
The 20 million Sunnis of the northern Middle East are key to stability. Otherwise, 10-year-old Americans will be 20-year-old Americans fighting there in the future. I'd like to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you all for showing up today, and thank you to my panelists. Great discussion. I hope you enjoyed it.